What my son-in-law didn't know was that the house he'd been threatening to sell out from under me had never been his to sell. I am Eugene Holt, and this is how I finally stopped being invisible in my own family. I'd built that house with my hands. Not a metaphor. I actually framed the walls, laid the subfloor, ran the wiring with my brother on weekends in 1987. My wife Norma picked out the kitchen cabinets from a catalog, and we argued for 3 weeks about whether to do oak or maple. We went oak. She was right. She was usually right. Norma passed 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, the house felt like a museum. Every room had her in it somewhere. The curtains she hemmed herself, the height marks she penciled on the laundry room door frame when our daughter was growing up. I kept every single one of them. My daughter Elaine is 41 now. She married a man named Stuart when she was 27. I walked her down the aisle at the Methodist Church on Birchwood Avenue. I cried. I'm not ashamed of that. Stuart works in commercial real estate. He's good at it. That part I'll give him. He has a way of looking at any space and immediately calculating what it's worth, who it could be sold to, what the comps are in the neighborhood. He talks about property the way some men talk about hunting, like everything out there is just waiting to be taken. I liked him well enough in the beginning. He was sharp. He made Elaine laugh, and he treated her well in those first years. They bought a house in Naperville, Illinois, about 40 minutes from mine. My grandson Tyler was born 2 years after the wedding. A boy with Norma's eyes and my stubborn chin, according to Elaine. I drove out to see him every Sunday. That was my routine. Sunday lunch, Tyler time, home by 4. Then the economy did what the economy does sometimes. Stuart's firm had a rough stretch. 3 deals fell through in the same quarter. A client sued over a property disclosure issue, and suddenly the man who had always walked into rooms like he owned them started walking in like he was calculating the exit. He never said directly that they were struggling. Men like Stuart don't say those things directly, but Elaine called me one night and I could hear it in how careful she was choosing her words. She said they'd been thinking it might make sense for the 3 of them to move in with me for a while, just to get back on their feet. Just temporarily. I said yes without hesitating. Tyler was 6. The idea of seeing him every day instead of every Sunday, I would have said yes to almost anything. They moved in on a Saturday in March. Stuart rented a moving truck himself, which I thought was considerate. He carried boxes in without being asked. He thanked me twice before dinner. That version of Stuart lasted about 4 months. I'm not going to pretend it happened all at once because it didn't. It was gradual. The way water damage is gradual. You don't see it until the wall is already soft. Little things at first. Stuart rearranging the garage without asking. Stuart mentioning casually that the oak cabinets were dated. Stuart suggesting we convert my workshop in the basement into a home office for him because he needed space to work. I gave up the workshop. I told myself it was temporary. By month 6, he had started referring to the house as our place when he was on the phone with clients. I heard him once from the hallway. Yeah, we've got plenty of room at our place. I stood there for a second, just long enough to feel the strangeness of it, and then I walked back to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee and didn't say anything. That was my first mistake, the silence. Because when you don't push back on the small things stop being small. By the end of the first year, Stuart had painted over the hallway without asking, covering the height marks on the laundry room doorframe. That was the one that got me. I didn't yell. I went out to the garage and sat in my truck for a long time. Elaine apologized. She said he didn't know what those marks meant. I believe she believed that. I'm less sure about Stuart. The money conversation happened 14 months after they moved in. Stuart sat down across from me at the kitchen table one evening after Tyler had gone to bed. He had a yellow legal pad. He actually had a legal pad. He went through what he called a household contribution structure, which was his way of telling me that since I was utilizing the property just as much as they were, it would make sense for me to cover half the utility costs going forward. I'm a retired electrician. I worked for 31 years for Midwest Power and Utility. I have a pension and social security. I live within my means, but I am not a wealthy man. And Stuart knew my income to within about $2,000 because Elaine had mentioned it offhandedly the previous Thanksgiving. I looked at the legal pad. I looked at him. I said I'd think about it. That night I called my brother Dennis, who lives down in Carbondale. Dennis is 70, 2 years younger than me. He was quiet for a moment after I explained the situation, and then he said, "Eugene, tell me you still have the deed in your name." I did. Of course I did. The house was paid off in 2009. My name, sole owner. Dennis said, "Then why are you thinking about it?" I didn't have a good answer. That was the night I started paying attention differently. I started noticing the way Stuart talked to Tyler. My grandson was 7 by then, bright kid, curious about everything, bugs, weather, how engines worked. But Stuart had started redirecting that curiosity. Whenever Tyler asked me something at dinner, Stuart would answer before I could. When Tyler wanted to come out to the garage with me to look at the truck engine on a Sunday afternoon, Stuart said he had something better to show him on the iPad. Tyler looked at me with this expression I can only describe as apologetic, a 7-year-old apologizing to his grandfather with his eyes. That was when I understood that this wasn't just about the house. I went to see a woman named Carol Fenn, who was a family law attorney in Wheaton. I want to be clear, I wasn't thinking about anything dramatic at that point. I just wanted to understand my rights in my own home. She told me several things I already knew and 2 things I didn't. The first thing I didn't know was that depending on how long a person had been living in a property, certain tenant protections could apply, even without a formal lease, meaning if I wanted them out, I couldn't just change the locks overnight. I would need to follow a process. The second thing was that a deed is a deed. That house was mine. Nothing Stuart had said or done in the previous 14 months had changed that in any legal sense. Not the paint, not the legal pad, not the utility negotiation he apparently thought had been settled. I drove home from Carol's office feeling, for the first time in over a year, like I could breathe. I didn't do anything immediately. I want to be honest about that. I went home and I watched Stuart at the dinner table that night. The way he cut Tyler's chicken without asking if Tyler wanted help. The way he interrupted Elaine twice while she was telling a story about her day at work. The way he looked at his phone while I was talking about a job I'd heard about from an old colleague. Just watching, filing it away. A week later, Stuart came to me with a new proposal. He'd found a property in the western suburbs, a 3-flat that needed significant renovation. He had a friend who would go in on it as a co-investor. He needed capital. He laid it out like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. I could put in $40,000. He'd manage the whole project, and we'd split the profit when they sold it. $40,000. I don't keep that much liquid, and he knew it. What he didn't know was that I did have a CD at my credit union, one I'd never mentioned to anyone, that had been sitting since Norma died. She'd set it up herself in 2012. I'd just kept renewing it. It had grown to $63,000. I said I'd need some time to look at the numbers. He smiled like that meant yes. I called Dennis again that night. I also called my credit union the next morning. I want to tell you what I observed over the following 3 weeks because this matters. I watched Stuart become warmer. He asked about my day. He offered to make dinner twice. He took Tyler to the park on a Sunday morning and made a point of telling me about it when they got back, like he was showing me what a good father he was. He started calling me Dad again. He'd been using my first name for months. I kept saying I was still looking at the numbers. I was also looking at apartments. I found a 2-bedroom unit in a complex in Downers Grove that allowed small dogs. I've been thinking about getting a dog for 2 years. Ground floor, small patio, 1,200 square feet. Nothing like my house, but clean, quiet, maintained. The leasing office manager was a woman named Patricia, who showed me around on a Tuesday afternoon and didn't once make me feel old for taking notes. I signed a 6-month lease and paid first and last month's rent. I told Patricia I'd be moving in the first of the following month. She handed me 2 sets of keys. I put them in my jacket pocket and drove home. That evening, Stuart asked if I'd had a chance to review the investment documents he'd left on the kitchen counter. I said yes. I said I wasn't going to be participating. The warmth left his face the way it leaves a room when a window opens in winter. Just gone. He said he thought I'd been seriously considering it. I said I had seriously considered it. He asked what my concerns were. I said my concerns were my business. He stood up from the table. He said, and I want to get this right because I've replayed it enough times that I have it exact. He said, Eugene, I've been patient with this situation. You're living under the same roof as my family and contributing basically nothing. I think you need to start thinking about what that looks like. Contributing nothing in my house that my wife and I built. I didn't raise my voice. I'd had 31 years of working with contractors and foremen and difficult project managers, and I learned early that the loudest person in the room almost never wins. I looked at him for a moment. I said, I'll think about what that looks like. He went upstairs. Elaine, who had heard the whole thing from the kitchen doorway, came and sat across from me. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with that evening. She said, Dad, he didn't mean it like that. I told her I knew. I asked if Tyler had finished his homework. She said yes. I said good. I waited until the weekend. Stuart and Elaine took Tyler up to her college roommate's wedding in Wisconsin. They left Friday afternoon and weren't coming back until Sunday evening. I had 2 days. Dennis drove up from Carbondale on Friday night. He brought his pickup. We worked through Saturday morning and afternoon. I packed everything that mattered to me, which was less than you'd think, and more than Stuart would ever understand. The oak chair Norma reupholstered the year before Tyler was born. The framed photograph from our 1991 camping trip to Upper Michigan. The handwritten recipe cards Norma kept in a wooden box by the stove. The fishing rods. My father's level and square from his toolbox. Tyler's height, too. I'd measured it myself on a separate piece of trim board and kept it in the closet. Norma's marks on the doorframe were gone, but I had my own record. I also took my files, every document related to the house, the deed, the paid-off mortgage paperwork, the property tax records, the insurance policy, all of it, into a folder, into a box, into the truck. I called a locksmith on Saturday afternoon, a perfectly legal thing to do in your own home. I had him rekey the front door, the side door, and the door to the garage. I paid him in cash and tipped him $20. I left a letter on the kitchen table. I want to be clear about what I wrote because I didn't write anything cruel. I wrote that the house was mine, had always been mine, and would remain mine. I wrote that they would need to collect their belongings and arrange alternative housing. I wrote that I had consulted with an attorney regarding their rights as occupants and included Carol Fenn's contact information in case they had legal questions. I wrote that Tyler was welcome at my new home any time he wanted to visit, and I included my new address and phone number. I did not write that I was angry. I didn't need to. Dennis and I had dinner at a diner in Downers Grove that night. Beef stew, cornbread, bad coffee that I loved anyway. Dennis said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it. I said I felt like I'd finally gone home, even though I was sitting in a booth I'd never sat in before. I don't know exactly what happened in that house when Stuart and Elaine pulled into the driveway Sunday evening. I wasn't there. I imagine Stuart tried his key first. I imagine he tried it again. I imagine the particular expression that would cross his face at that moment, not just frustration, but the slow dawning recognition that the ground he'd been standing on had never been his. Elaine called me Sunday night. She was crying, and I let her cry because she's my daughter and she was scared, and I'm not a man who needs to be right out loud. When she quieted down, I told her that I loved her. I told her none of this was about her. I told her that I had put a family in a difficult position by staying silent for too long, and that was on me, and I was sorry for that part. She asked where she was supposed to go. I told her that Stuart worked in real estate. I said that gently, but I said it. Over the following weeks, a few things happened. Stuart sent me 2 emails, both of which I forwarded to Carol without responding to directly. He raised the possibility of legal action. Carol reviewed everything and told me that his position was exceptionally weak. The deed was clear, there was no lease, and the timeline of occupancy did not establish the kind of tenancy rights that would require a formal eviction in Illinois. He did not pursue anything. Elaine and Stuart found an apartment in Wheaton within 3 weeks. It was humbling, probably. I hope it was clarifying. Tyler called me on a Tuesday evening about a month after everything happened. He's 8 now. He asked if I really had a dog. I told him not yet, but I was working on it. He asked if he could come see the new apartment. I said I would love nothing more in this world. The following Saturday, Elaine dropped him off at noon. He walked in, looked around at the boxes I still hadn't fully unpacked, and spotted a photograph of Norma on the bookshelf. He said, "Is that Grandma?" I said, "Yes." He said, "She looks like she was nice." I sat down on the couch. I said, "She was the best person I ever knew." He climbed up next to me and leaned against my arm, and we sat there for a while without saying anything. Outside, a neighbor was mowing his lawn. Somewhere down the hall, someone was cooking something with garlic and onions. The afternoon light came through the sliding glass door and stretched across the floor toward us. 3 weeks later, I got a golden retriever from a rescue organization in Joliet. 8 months old, already house-trained, with a tendency to lean against your leg when you're standing still. Tyler named him Biscuit on the first visit. I have room in my life now. That sounds like a small thing. It isn't. I spent too many months shrinking, getting quieter at dinner tables, giving up workshops, watching height marks get painted over without saying a word. I kept telling myself it was patience. It wasn't patience. It was me forgetting that a man who builds something with his own hands doesn't owe anyone permission to stand in it. I know what I am. I am Eugene Holt. I am 69 years old. I am a retired electrician, a grandfather, a man who once framed a wall and wired a kitchen and argued about oak cabinets with the woman he loved for 32 years. I kept the deed. I kept the recipe cards. I kept the measurement of my grandson's height when he was 7 years old, marked in pencil on a piece of trim board that's leaning against the wall in my new bedroom, right next to the window. Some things you don't let anyone paint over. I keep coming back to the moment Stuart sat down at my kitchen table with that yellow legal pad. Not because it was the worst moment. It wasn't, not even close. But because of how unsurprised I was. That's the part that stayed with me. I sat across from him and listened to words like household contribution structure, and I didn't feel shock. I felt recognition. Like I'd been watching something build for a long time, and had just been too polite to name it. That's the thing about letting small things slide. You tell yourself it's patience. You tell yourself it's keeping the peace for your daughter, for your grandson, for the family you're trying to hold together. But there's a difference between patience and erasure, and I'd been letting myself get erased one quiet moment at a time. The workshop, the cabinet comments, the painted-over doorframe, until the man sitting across from me genuinely believed that the house I'd built with my own hands was something he had a claim on. Stuart didn't become who he was overnight. Neither did I. The choices we make every day, the things we accept, and the things we push back on, they compound. They become the shape of a life. Stuart chose, repeatedly, to take more than he'd earned. He chose to use Tyler as leverage, to use Elaine's loyalty as a buffer, to use my silence as permission, and each of those choices brought him closer to the morning he found a key that no longer worked in a door he'd never actually owned. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because it's true, and because it matters. Actions build on themselves, for better or worse, and the account eventually settles. What I had to reckon with was my own part in it. I stayed silent when Stuart first started reshaping my house around himself. I gave up the workshop. I let the height marks get painted over without fighting for them. A man with genuine backbone, with the kind of character that holds its shape under pressure, would have drawn those lines earlier. I know that. It took me 14 months and a phone call from my brother and a consultation with an attorney to remember who I was and what I'd built. That's not a victory lap. That's a lesson I paid for in lost time. What finally moved me wasn't anger. It was Tyler. Watching an 8-year-old learn to apologize with his eyes for wanting to spend time with his grandfather. That clarified everything. Protecting that boy required me to be clear-headed, not reactive. I needed to understand my legal standing before I acted. I needed to make a plan, keep it quiet, execute it without drama. That's not a cold thing. That's what it looks like when you've thought something all the way through, instead of just feeling it. Tyler named my dog Biscuit on his first visit to the apartment. He leaned against my arm and looked at a photograph of Norma and said she looked like she was nice. I built a house once. I know how long it takes to make something solid. How many measurements, how many adjustments, how many mornings you show up and just keep working. The same is true for a life worth living. It doesn't happen in a gesture. It happens in the 10,000 small decisions about what you'll accept and what you won't, about who deserves your trust and who has spent it, about when to stay quiet and when staying quiet is just another way of losing yourself. I kept the deed. I kept the recipe cards. I kept the trim board with Tyler's height marked in pencil. Some things you hold on to, not out of stubbornness, but because they're the evidence of who you actually are.